Right, welcome to Literature in English class once again. My name is Jesse Josh. All right, so in the previous classes, we've talked about poetry and the types of poetry that we have. We've talked about a lot, so if you missed the videos, I'm basically just going to do a recap. I'm not going to say all I've said before, right? So just go back and watch the videos on the types of poetry that we already talked about. We're still going to talk about just two types of poetry, and that will be all on types of poetry. We've basically exhausted all the types of poetry that we have. Okay, so we'll talk about the last two today, and then we'll move into the features or the elements of poetry, which is going to be, worth your while. Okay, it's going to be worth the while. All right, so let's talk about, let's do a recap on the types of poem that we've talked about in the previous classes. All right, so we talked about the lyric, the musical poem accompanied by a musical instrument called the lyre. We talked about the dirge, right, that is used to mourn a dead person, right? It is a poem used to is sung to mourn the death of a person. We talked about the elegy. The elegy is used to, portray. It's a poem. It's a sad poem, basically. It portrays and expresses negative emotions, right? Hatred, anger, sorrow, depression, frustration, and other types of negative emotions. We talked about the limerick, how it is also called the nonsense verse. It's basically a 5-line poem, a poem of 5 lines, and it's nonsense. It's a nonsense verse. It's a very funny poem that is usually very witty, right, and comedic. Okay. We talked also about a dramatic poem, a poem that is very, very dramatic in that it could be read as a monologue or a dialogue. It is dramatic in the sense that it could be read, right? It has elements of drama. It is written in distinct tones. So a dramatic poem has distinct tones. So the first stanza could have a distinct poem different from the second stanza. That's the whole point of a dramatic poem. And the narrative poem, we talked about the narrative poem, is a poem that narrates, basically tells a story, right? And under this narrative poem, we talked about the ballad and the epic, all of which are both narrative poems, but have their characteristics which are different. The ballad talks about poems focusing on themes like love, betrayal, hatred, and other things. And it's usually passed from one generation to another through word of mouth. Okay, and as it is with all stories that are passed through word of mouth, we don't have a particular author or originator of the story. Then we have the epic, which is also similar to the ballad because it's also a narrative poem. The epic, talks about things like conquest, war, basically conquest, right? So you are talking about battles and victories and losses in that poem. All right. So we talked about that. We talked about the lullaby, how the lullaby is a poem that's sung for children, to put them in a relaxed mood, right? We talked about the sonnets, how a sonnet is a 14-line poem. And that we also talked about the types of the sonnet, the Petrarchan sonnet, the Shakespearean sonnet, the Spenserian sonnet, and the Miltonic sonnet. We talked about the features and characteristics of the types of sonnet that we talked about. We talked about how they are divided, right, and their rhyme scheme. You have to go back to the last videos to watch them and understand them. We also talked about the panegyric. Yes, we talked about the panegyric, about a praise poem focusing on the highlighting positive, negative, or weird attributes of a person, entity, or thing, including animals. And we talked about we created a distinction between the panegyric and the ode, right? How the ode is a praise poem and how it highlights just basically to praise an individual or an entity, and so I likened the panegyric and the ode to your oriki, okay, right? So those are the poems that we've talked about, and today we're going to be talking about the last 2 poems, right? Now, please go back and watch the other videos so that you don't miss out on anything that we've been talking about. So we're going to be talking about the haiku. Haiku is a Japanese poem also called senryu. Of course, definitely that would be a Japanese word. It's called senryu. Okay, so this Japanese poem is very short. It's so short. It's so short that it has just 3 lines. Yeah, 3 lines. Now, the first line of this poem and the third line of this poem has 7 syllables, and the second line has 5 syllables. I hope I'm correct about that. The first line has 7 syllables and the third line has 7 syllables. The second line, remember I told you that the poem of just 3 lines has what? 5 syllables. Now, this Japanese poem is basically to teach a lesson about life, a moral. It's usually said it could be to the Japanese. They sound like they are usually proverbial. They are proverb-like. Okay, so they are trying to teach you a lesson, right, or something. You know, it's usually the meaning is usually embedded in the words or in the wordings of the poem. So it's basically a Japanese poem called senryu. All right. The next and final type of poem we're going to be looking at to round off our types of poetry is the traditional poem. The traditional poem. Now, basically, from the title or from the name, it's a poem that focuses on tradition, but in this case, the African tradition. So it basically talks about the things. It talks about the tradition of Africa, you know, the origin, the tradition of different cultures in Africa, and probably, you know, it talks and highlights specific or commendable parts about these traditions, you get, and how they affect the society at large. So the traditional poem is basically a poem that talks about or portrays the African tradition, right? So when we say African, you know, it's not necessarily Nigeria or, you know, whatever country you are in. It could be South Africa, it could be Ghana, it could be it's just basically an African traditional poem. All right, so that rounds up our topic on types of poetry. So I just took 2 in this class, so you have to go back to the other videos, like I said earlier, to catch up on the other main types of poem that we already talked about. I hope you enjoyed the types of poetry class.